Good evening, everybody. Sorry to interrupt your conversation and your social hour and your fellowship. It's nice to hear the buzz about the place, so great. Feel free to stick around afterwards and keep on talking. And lots of great stuff to talk about tonight. Of course, there's always lots of great stuff to talk about when you're talking about the Bible, but this is a couple of chapters that really afford us the chance to get into lots of things, and it will be a fairly frustrating experience for me trying to get to all of it over the course of an hour. But we'll do our best, and we'll call attention to some of the major teachings of Jesus in these two chapters with the hope that it stirs in all of us some good conversation in our small groups and maybe in your relationships and in your anybody going out to dinner after this? No? Okay, well, in case you were, it might spur some conversation there too. So, oh, there's a phone ringing. So let that be your reminder to check your cell phones before we get going. So let's pray. Thanks, oh God, for this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful day, and we're grateful for this beautiful night, and thankful that we get the chance to wonder again about your word and about the Gospel of Luke and the great stories of Luke's Gospel that challenge us and perhaps open us up to hear your Gospel spoken to us. And we pray that we will put down our defenses and allow you to speak. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we are in Luke chapter 15. I better check my cell phone too. Wouldn't that be embarrassing? That's why I never bring my cell phone up on the chancel. I'm always afraid I'd forget to turn the ringer off or whatever. So we are in Luke 15 and 16. I have to say that Luke 15 is one of my all-time favorite chapters, and it actually contains the story that I preached on Sunday. So interesting how the planets aligned there for us to not only hear it through the preached moment, now to hear it through the teached moment, and we'll be approaching it very differently tonight than what we did on Sunday. And that's followed by, and the story of the Prodigal Son is another one of those unique parables known only in Luke's Gospel, followed in Luke 16 by another unique parable known only to Luke's Gospel. So we'll want to pay attention to some of that. And we'll want to be reminded as we're looking at Luke 15 and 16 about the overarching themes that we've been noticing. Pardon me, I got a little tickle in my throat. Pardon me. Glad I brought this. See, I've already offended people. They're already leaving. I cough and they've moved to the back row. I don't know what that means. We talked about this last week. We're always wanting to keep in mind a couple of things about Luke. Theme number one, the great reversal, right? And over and over again, Luke reminds us that the gospel message of Jesus has a lot to do with Jesus' revolution, which is to turn the world upside down and to invite us to consider a world upside down from where we may find ourselves. In Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1, in Luke 2, and in Luke 4, and in Luke 10, and various places, everything gets switched around. Samaritans turn out to be good people, and the poor will rise and the rich will fall. The announcement of the birth of Jesus is to the lowly shepherds. So the whole world gets turned upside down. That's number one. And then number two is that, if we're listening to Luke and we're listening to this inauguration of the kingdom of heaven, where we hear over and over again, and we certainly heard that in the last couple of chapters, that the kingdom of heaven is like this, the kingdom of heaven is like that, especially as we're listening to Jesus through the Gospel of Luke, we are imagining that the kingdom of heaven is that orientation, and for us, many of us, it's a reversal from seeing the world being about me as opposed to the world being about us. But the kingdom of heaven is about us. It's not about me. And that's, in many respects, as I just said, is a great reversal for us, right? What do you mean? I'm not the center of the universe? You mean it's not just about what God has, what plan God has for my life? No, it's about God's plan for the world and His invitation for us to be a part of that plan. So we want to keep these things in mind when we're making our way through Luke 15 and 16. So Luke 15, and Luke does a good job of this. We'll see the examples of this in Luke 15 and 16, where he sets up a context in order to present a teaching of Jesus. So context number one in Luke 15 begins with the first two verses of the chapter when he says, "Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to Jesus, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, 'This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" Now, already you have this thing set up where the Pharisees are saying, it's about us. It's not about them. It's about whether or not you've got your act together. It's about whether or not you follow the law. It's about me. It's not really, we don't really want to bother ourselves with those others. As long as I got my act together, it doesn't really matter about the others. But Jesus' ministry is one that is attracting the others. They are drawing near to him, and he's choosing to eat with them. And the whole notion of table manners, as it were, was very significant in the Jewish tradition, right? Because one of the ways by which a Jew was identified was the way by which he or she ate. This wasn't like just, going out to, Bonefish Grill and having, something to eat with, the undesirables. This was choosing to engage in dietary practice outside of oneself for the sake of being in relationship with the other. He eats with them. He risks stepping outside of the dietary prohibitions to engage with the us. So there's something radical going on already with Jesus' ministry, and I can't help but think of a story that I've shared before in teaching and I think probably in preaching as well about those two college students of a new college. Remember that story? Matthew Stevenson and Derek Black. Derek Black, the white nationalist. Matthew Stevenson, the practicing Jew. Both students. Derek Black is outed for being a white nationalist, and he is shunned by the larger academic community for his white nationalism. And it takes a Matthew Stevenson, a Jew, to invite Derek Black, a white nationalist, to enjoy Shabbat dinner on Friday night, to have table fellowship, without any agenda, and especially not with the agenda of trying to debate white nationalism versus, versus openness and inclusion. And that process goes for 2 years until finally Derek Black begins to realize that he loves these people and that his philosophy that he had espoused was contrary to the relationships he had formed, only as a result of having been invited to table. So Jesus invites to table and is invited to table with those with whom the Pharisees, to be sure, and others would have been diametrically opposed. Jesus risks his becoming unclean by choosing to be at table with. So that's what sets up the rest of Luke 15, which is a succession of 3 stories. You may recall 3 stories that we refer to as the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son, or the lost son. It's an interesting indication of how the human church sort of views things, when actually they are not primarily stories about lostness. They are primarily stories about foundness. They are primarily stories about the protagonist whose yearning is to find. Whose yearning is to find. So I'm not going to spend much time on the first 2 parables. The lost sheep, the good shepherd who discovers that one of the 99 are lost, and the good shepherd leaves the 99 because it's all about finding the one who is lost. And he searches for the lost sheep until he finds it. He brings it home and rejoices over finding the lost one and bringing the lost one home. Same thing with the lost coin. In this case, a woman loses a coin inside her house, and so she searches up and down, over, in, and out in order to find that lost coin. And when she finds the lost coin, she rejoices and invites her friends to come and celebrate with the fact that she has found that which was lost. So we have a build-up, perhaps, and maybe that's why Jesus tells these stories in succession. They are a build-up to the ultimate story, which is the story of the loving Father, the searching Father, the passionate Father, who won't ever rest until he knows his Son has been found. So we're going to take a few minutes and take a look at this story and kind of pull it apart a bit more and try to mine from it that which I think is compelling for us to take away from this story. So I'll just kind of read my way through it, and as I'm reading through it, we'll stop and we'll take a look at some of the interesting dynamics that are happening in this story. And right from the beginning, this is beginning with verse 11, and the story goes from 11 through the end of the chapter. Then Jesus said, there was a man. So we already know the story is about a man, and we learn right away that the man is the father. So this is a story about him. We call it the story of the prodigal son, but it's really not a story about the prodigal son. The story is about the man who had 2 sons. There was a man who had 2 sons, and I said in my sermon on Sunday, that he had 2 very different children. And how many of you, have any of you had like 2 different kinds of children? Yeah, hands shoot up. I'm one of 4 sons, and big differences between us. With the other 3 could be like me, but it just didn't turn out that way. So there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So the father divided his property between them. A couple things about that. First of all, when the son says, "I want my share of the estate," he is, in my perspective, to read between the lines, what the son is saying is, Dad, I wish you were dead. That's how I understand this relationship. The money's more important than you are. He wants his share of the estate, which in Palestinian culture, it meant because he was the younger son, he received a third of the estate. Always the older son, takes precedence in most things in Palestinian Jewish culture. It's the oldest that gets the birthright, gets the namesake, gets the lion's share of the estate, which may in itself build up a little resentment among siblings. Who's to know? So I'd rather you out of the picture, Dad. I'd rather the cash because I want to strike out on my own. And so what's the first loving thing possibly that the father does? He gives him the money and lets him go. And, parents, that's always an interesting experience, right? About letting your children go. Blessing them on their way. So the father lets him go. Maybe he didn't really have a choice, who's to know? But certainly not only did he let him go, he gave him a cash advance on the will. A few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself over to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. So, there's a lot of things this younger boy doesn't understand, right? He doesn't understand about saving money. He doesn't understand about how, circumstances can change in a moment. He doesn't understand about what his options might be when circumstances go the wrong way. Why? Because he's chosen to distance himself from the Father. So he's put himself out on his own. And he has somewhere along the way convinced himself, long before he left home, that he really did have a better way. That anything was better than this. He had a better way. And so he distanced himself. He goes to the far country. Dad, I want you out of the picture. I'm going to go to the far country, and I'm going to do it my way. And he does it his way. And, and it's interesting. I think us human beings are like this. How easy it is for us to convince ourselves that we've got it figured out. Right? How easy it is to sell ourselves on a really bad plan. How easy it is for us to convince ourselves that actually we're having a better time than what we really are having. And I think of back when I was a high school student, I had my little group of buddies. And I was, my father drilled into me this whole teetotaling thing, so I was not one who drank when I was in high school, so which meant I was the candidate for designated driver, right? Back before they even had designated drivers, I got to be designated driver. And so I got to be the one that drove us all around to different places and different parties where I didn't imbibe, but my friends sure did. And it was always interesting because that they thought that was just the greatest thing, and and they would get drunker and drunker over the course of an evening, and invariably we'd be pulling off to some alley while these guys were tossing their their cookies all over and they were thinking they were still having a good time. It's like, hey, it's like, wow, you think this is great? Wonderful. We have this ability, don't we, to sell ourselves on a certain way of life, and even in the midst, so the younger son, he's selling himself on this plan. And he's somehow still convincing himself that feeding pigs is not a bad thing. And even hoping for the pods that the pigs ate. That this is still better than being home with Dad. So we get invited in the story to wonder to ourselves, well, how is it that I perhaps in my life, maybe even now, have convinced myself that the way I've chosen to live my life has got to be better than what Jesus wants me to do? And has, in a sense, built up a defense against the commands of Christ. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we get to Luke 16. And then there's this brilliant line that Luke gives us in verse 17 when it says, "And when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but I'm dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' When he came to himself." I mean, that's language that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and 3, where we learn at the beginning of it all that we were created in the image of God. That when you come to yourself, you come to an understanding of yourself in relationship to your Creator. The young son comes to himself and sees himself in relationship to his father. The story begins with him wanting to pull himself away from the relationship with the father. But when he comes to himself, when he understands who he is, he can only see himself in relationship to his father. Now, there are tons of motivations for him to feel that way. Many of them self-serving, right? Because he's blown the money, he's sitting in a pigsty, he's eating pig pods. And so there's a lot of self-serving motivation for him to come to himself, right? But nevertheless, that's what he does. And so what does he do? He rehearses himself a speech. He says, okay, well, got to come up with a speech because there's no way Dad's going to buy this one. And he talks about, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. And there's no reason to think that he doesn't feel that way and understand where he's put himself. And maybe that's one of the great revelations that he's had. He's understood where he's put himself. But that's the speech that he rehearses when he's thinking about going home. So in verse 20, so he set off and went to the father. But while he was afar off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion, and he ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, quickly bring out of the robe the best one, put it on him, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. So a few things about that. First of all, the son makes the decision to head home. And what is it that provokes the father's compassion? The sight. I didn't hear it.
The sight. He sees his son.
The sight of the boy, not the words of the boy. And that's a very important theological point that's being made, I think, in this story. Likely the father's compassion is not even, the father's compassion was there already, right? Because he's waiting for that boy. He could see that boy afar off because he's been looking for the boy. He's been sitting on that porch asking the servant and saying, you think today's the day that he comes back? you think today's the day when he comes back? He's always looking on the horizon for his son to come. And it takes only the sight of the boy for the father to run. And again, in good Palestinian culture, what the father has done is he's thrown off all decorum. And he has made his way to his son. He doesn't care what the neighbors think. He doesn't care what axes they may have to grind against the son. He doesn't care what the elder son thinks. He just is, the only thing that matters to him is that his boy is making his way back. It doesn't matter what the motive is. It doesn't matter what the words are. In fact, when the son starts into the speech, he only can get halfway through the speech before his father interrupts him and says, I don't care what you have to say. All I care is that you're here. And oh, by the way, shouts out to the slaves, kill the fatted calf and get the best robe and put the ring on his finger and sand the shoes on his feet and blah, 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 because we are going to celebrate. Because that's all that matters. And it, at least as I read it, as I think Luke intends it, the rest of it is a mixed bag, right? The rest of it's a mixed bag. And likely will continue to be a mixed bag, as we find out, certainly in a relationship to the older brother. This boy's return home, I mean, there's a lot more chapters to this story, right? And, there's all sorts of stuff that has to get pulled apart on this, and there may be more bad behaviors to come. But the whole thing has to do with the relationship, and that the son has understood himself in some way or the other in relationship to the father, which I think is an important thing for us to hold on to when it comes to how we theologically get at what does it really mean to be saved? What does it really mean to be, to be loved by God? What is the nature of God's love? Is it a conditional love? Does it have to mean that you've got to recite a certain set of lines in order for God to love you or God to accept you? There's a whole lot of stuff, and we're not here to try to answer all those questions, but we have to open ourselves up to those questions when we read this story. So the father, throws off all abandon, and he decides to have this big party. Why? Because this son of mine was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. It's interesting how those two phrases get put back to each other. You would think that for emphasis, it would have been turned around the other way. My son was lost and is found. He was even dead and is now alive. Instead, it's the other way around. My son was dead and is now alive. He was lost and is found. This lost and found thing, I think, is an interesting emphasis that Jesus gives to the story. It's like almost that the lost and the found was even more important than the dead and alive. I'm not sure exactly where to go with that, but it's just an interesting way that the story gets told. Verse 25, now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. And he replied, your brother has come, and your father's killed the fatted calf because he's got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came and began to plead with him, for he answered but he answered his father, listen. You see his teeth clenched. Listen. For all these years I've been working like a slave for you. I've never disobeyed your command, yet you've never given me a young goat. I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, so he can't speak of that boy in relationship to himself. He can only speak of this boy in relationship to the father. He's your son. You do with him what you want. This son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes. You killed the fatted calf for him. Then the father said to him, turns the language around and says, son. Let's reestablish a relationship. It's you and me. You're my son. Son. You are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. We had to celebrate. Why? Because I'm the father. That's what fathers do when sons come home. We didn't have any choice here. We had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours, let's reestablish the relationship. This brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. So it's interesting. You know what the Greek word for elder is? The elder son. The Greek word for elder is presbyteros, from which we get the word Presbyterian. So the Presbyterian son is not happy. The Presbyterian son is not happy with grace. The Presbyterian son wants flesh out of this kid. And he most certainly, and what is he most concerned about? Is he most concerned about the son coming home? Or is he more concerned about the fact that his father's celebrating it? Which is an interesting thing when it comes to this notion of grace. Because I think as human beings, you know, we have in our minds, and rightfully so in many respects, we have in our minds that, you know, when you do bad things, you receive justice. And there needs to be a judge, and there needs to be an arbiter, and you squandered the property, you squandered all of the family's money, and so you deserve justice. We'll let you back, but we ain't throwing you no party. Right? This happens all the time in families, right? Well, you know, Charlie, he came to you and asked for loans, like all the way through college and into when he was getting off into, you know, starting his career. And, you know, I mean, you bankrolled this and this and this. I never asked you for a dime. And now you're splitting the estate 50-50. That doesn't make sense. He's into you for $100,000, but you don't show that up in the estate. You're still getting him 50-50. I deserve more. I didn't ask for any money. I can't tell you how often I've been in that conversation. I can't tell you how often that's been true. Because, you know, it's even Steven, right? You know, that's the way we look at life. But grace looks at life entirely differently. And so the elder son won't bring himself to celebrate, and he won't see himself in relationship to the family, this son of yours. And that's what prevents him from experiencing the joy of the Father. Which, again, is another example of it's not about me, it's about us, right? The elder son says, whoa, 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 what about me? You know, he sees himself, and he's most concerned about what he deserves. He can't see himself in relationship to the family. He can't participate in the joy of the Father because the Father loves both sons. Because that's what fathers do. The Father loves both sons. And the elder son says, you got to make a choice. It's got to be more about me than about him. He has lost his chance. He doesn't deserve it. And the Father says, oh, it's not about deserving. Love is never about deserving. Love is just about welcoming and inclusion into the family. So there's these three wonderful stories where where the spotlight is on this father who is seeking to welcome the two different sons into his communion. And so that it doesn't become the father, the temptation we have to make it either or. You either love me or you love him. The father makes it a both and. Oh, I've loved the both of you from the very start, and I will love you both to the very end. You remember that story, I've shared this in a sermon before, about the mother who had four children, and she got asked the question, which one of them do you love the most? And she says, well, I love them all the same. And then they asked again, well, you got to love at least one more than the others. No, I love them all the same. Well, come on, really, seriously. Honest engine. Which one do you love more than the others? And she says, you're right. I do love one more than the others. And the one I love most is the one who's in the most trouble. I think that's an interesting lens through which to look at, and what the prodigal son invites us to look at is that the love of the Father is perhaps even most for the one who's in the most trouble. He loves that boy, and he's so grateful for that boy to be home because he loves him. Doesn't that the trouble is not the thing, which is the interesting thing because in the story of the prodigal son, I got to get off the story quick because we're running out of time. The interesting thing about the prodigal son is that we call it the prodigal son. We kind of almost focus on all the bad things the prodigal son did, when actually the story is about the father and the way the father loves. He goes out to both sons. He runs after the lost son, and he leaves the party and goes after the elder son. He's loving them in different ways, right? And wanting them both to be in the party, at the feast. So, all right. So Luke 16, we have two parables, and I'm going to just speak briefly about one and then a little bit more about the other. And this may be the point at which you'd like to leave because this is about money. And it won't leave you feeling comfortable. So just fair warning. So I'm going to read verses 1 through 9, talk about that for a minute, and then I'm going to jump to verse 19 and talk about that parable as well. Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager. Listen to this story because when you're reading this story, it's going to like, what is Jesus talking about? Jesus said to the disciples, remember, he's teaching now to the disciples, not teaching to the crowd, he's teaching just to the disciples. There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Then the manager said to himself, oh boy, what will I do now that my master has taken the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I'm dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? And he answered, well, I owe him 100 jugs of olive oil. And he said to him, well, you might take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it out to 50. Then he asked another, how much do you owe? He said, well, I owe him 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill, put it down to 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it's gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Does that sound problematic to you? I've read that fast, so it may be a story you have to go back to and read, and I invite you to do so. Because at face value, it sounds like Jesus is saying, you know what? I invite you to be dishonest. I invite you to be shrewd and to act in a way that's not only dishonest, but is self-serving for you. So the basis of the story is that this manager is he's basically a bill collector. And he goes out to collect the debts of his master. And when he realizes he's going to lose his job because he's been cooking the books, he realizes that his really only hope is to put himself into favor with the customers of this manager, of this master. So in order to put himself in favor with these customers, he basically skims more off the top in relationship to the master. He says, well, you owe him 100, cut it down to 50. That way, you'll really appreciate me when I lose my job, and I might be able to get some business with you. I might be able to be in relationship with you going further, because I don't want to beg, I don't want to dig. I want to keep working this money thing. I want to be shrewd with the money. And the manager and the master says, wow, you are one smart guy. And you're like, well, he's been skimming off the top. He's been taking me. What is this all about? Well, without going into a whole lot of detail about this, because there's a lot to pick apart, that's why I invite you to go and read it with maybe this idea in mind. Jesus will sometimes tell a story that the meaning of which is not buried in the details, it's buried in the overall principle. And the overall principle in this story is that when it comes to the use of our resources, when it comes to the use of what we've been given, our shrewdness needs to be about the future. So the shrewdness of the servant, the bill collector, was about his future, right? Like, I'm going to lose my job here, so I got to set myself up for what's coming, right? So when Jesus is talking to his disciples, he says, and really this could possibly be a teaching about money, because the rest of the chapter ends up being about money. His teaching to the disciples is, with whatever money you get, whatever resources you get, the temptation is to be using them for the present, when actually you should be using your resources for the future. Now, for the future, as we'll learn later on in this chapter, is not about, save your money for a rainy day. The future is about the coming kingdom. So you want to be using your money consistent with the coming kingdom. Your temptation is to use your money for earthly kingdom, for yourself. But what Jesus is inviting us to is a use of money for the coming kingdom. We've all learned a long time ago that what you got to do is set yourself up for retirement. Right? Did anybody not get that message when you were, my father beat that into my brain when I was a good Presbyterian pastor. He's like, save money for retirement. That was the teaching. And maybe not as much. Use your money for the purposes of the kingdom. Get used to using your money for the purposes of the kingdom. Get used to using your money for the purposes of us and not about me. That's a whole reversal, right, of our worldviews. And so as to drive home the point, beginning in verse 14, Luke tells us, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed Jesus. And so he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts, for what is prized by human beings is an abomination in the sight of God. Now, likely underneath all of this is a very important theological disagreement that was had about the intentions of God when it comes to, quote, blessings. The Pharisees likely were of the mind, when Luke tells us they were lovers of money, they were likely of the mind of the school of thought that said, and this can be backed up in some of the Torah, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, that the blessing of wealth was a sign of God's favor. You were blessed with wealth because God has been happy with who you are. You deserve it. This is the divine blessing on you. This is sort of similar to somebody saying, you walk into, their mansion, or you sit inside their beautiful car, or whatever. They take you out and they say, God has so richly blessed me. And now, there's two sides of that coin, right? There's somewhat of a humble statement there, like, thank the good Lord that I've received what I've received. But there's this other side to it that has the echo of, look what God's done for me. And poor sap over here. Something must be wrong. Because that's where that theology ended up, was that if you've done something, if you haven't received, no problem. No. Choir practice, I'll let you go. The others, I will shame you if you leave early. So that theology can make its way to the point of saying that that the reverse is also true, that you are blessed because God favors you, and you are not blessed because God does not favor you. And there are lots of folks even today that still hold on to that as a theology of resource. And that can be problematic, I think, especially in Luke's gospel. So to illustrate this, Jesus tells the story in verse 19 and following. I'll read through the whole parable and then I'll make a couple of comments. There was a rich man. There's the two parables in Luke 16 begin with those 4 words or 5 words. There was a rich man. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, that is the place of the dead, that was the first century understanding. First century understanding didn't understand, the first century Palestinian Jewish thought was that everyone went to the place of the dead. That's where everybody went. So Lazarus goes to the place of the dead. The rich man goes to the place of the dead, where he was being tormented. And he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." And he said, "Well then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, and that they will not also come into this place of torment." And Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." And he said, "Well, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." And he said to him, "If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." So a few things here. it can be really difficult for us to imagine how this rich man acts the way he does. At one level, we might want to say this about ourselves, and that, well, what decent human being would let that poor man suffer right in front of his gate? What decent human being would do that? He should have done something. So we can somehow cast this rich man as certainly much worse than we might be. But the reality is that we're living in his poverty all the time, right? There's poor people at our gate, metaphorically at the very least. So we're already sort of drawn into the story to some degree. But it could very well be that the rich man is informed by this theology, right? Which is, God loves me. And boy, I wonder what happened to that guy that God has chosen to disfavor him so awfully. That allows him to remain in his little palace and feast sumptuously every day because he believes it's all blessing. It's all, it's God doing his thing. And sucks to be you, he says. That's not the Greek translation, but in essence, that's what he's saying. That tough luck, pal. And so, what's the purpose of this whole story? Is the purpose of the whole story to give us definition around how does it work? When what is it that leads us to heaven and what is it that leads us to hell? Is it trying to give us signs of what the afterlife is like? And, are we able to talk back and forth between heaven and Hades and so on and so forth? It's not the point of the story. The point of the story is back to this question with the Pharisees. The Pharisees love money, and Jesus says, well, guess what? The kingdom is not about you. The kingdom for the rich man, who tradition is called Dives, the kingdom is not about Dives, the kingdom is about Dives and Lazarus. And that there is going to need to be a reversal, that there is going to be, that the yearning of the Father, back to the Prodigal Son, the yearning of the Father is that the rich man is brought lower and the poor man is brought higher. That somehow there is a meeting of these two. But that's not going to happen unless the rich man surrenders, gives away, releases himself from what has in a very real sense owned him. And he begins to make his life more about the poor beggar than about himself. And then, Jesus then includes at the end of this story about the resurrection, and it's something consistent with Luke's gospel. Periodically throughout the gospel, Luke wants to remind us that Jesus' teaching is consistent with the law and the prophets. And really, this is what the debate is about throughout the Gospel of Luke and the other Gospels as well, the synoptics. There's this ongoing debate as to what is the correct interpretation of the law and the prophets. What's the correct interpretation? And if you remember the Bible class I taught back in the fall, how I said that the Bible is in itself this conversation that's going back and forth. The law of Moses is in conversation with the prophets. The Old Testament's in conversation with the New Testament. Jesus is in conversation with Paul. I mean, there's all sorts of dialogue going back and forth, and it's all toward trying to understand the essence of the will and purpose of God as revealed in the law, in the prophets, and in the person of Jesus. How are we to understand what God's will is? And so at the end of this parable, Jesus reminds us that, oh, by the way, it's You may not get it in your interpretation of Moses and the law and the prophets. And then he makes this reference to the resurrection of the dead, which is an indication that he wants to put out there to suggest that ultimately the interpretation of the law and the prophets ends up with him. That he is the interpreter of the law and the prophets. And so in this conversation with the Pharisees, who are probably embedded in this theology that God favors me, Jesus is offering a counterpoint, which is, you got it wrong. The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is about the rich man and the poor man together. And that life is all about how that reversal happens such that those two cohabitate in the kingdom. So, I think I'll end there. I think I've exhausted you all in Luke 15 and 16. But aren't those great stories? And maybe just to make one final point, none of this really matters, does it? None of this matters a hill of beans if we won't allow it to work its way into us, right? That's why Jesus tells these parables. Because I can't tell you how often when I've taught on the parable of the Prodigal Son or the loving Father, there will be a line of people that come up, and this is to suggest that maybe you don't form that line tonight, that will come up to me and say, you know what, I think that elder son had a point. I mean, if I were in his shoes, I'd feel the same way. Doggone it, I've been working like a slave for the dad, and, I never even asked for a kid, a young goat to have, I kind of side with that guy, That father didn't pay any attention to the elder son. Well, that's the whole point of the story, right? Jesus tells the story because he wants to slip that in, and he wants that to work on us. He wants that to say, well, if that's what you're feeling, then maybe you need a refresher course on grace. Maybe your law and justice, law and order, has to be tempered by the good news of grace. Maybe you need to see yourself as the elder son who has decided not to be a part of the party. God got it? I'll show him. So, and likewise the rich man and his nice estate. Is that story going to work on us? Does that story propel us to go home and sit down with our significant other and say, what more can we do to make sure that that poor man's brought up to a different place? And what might we surrender in order for that to happen? That's the fun part. It's the scary part, but it's the fun part. All right, questions, comments, thoughts on all of that? I have numbed you. Yes, madame.
I don't.
Here comes Miggy with a microphone.
Thank you. I don't think the father ever thought his son was dead. He had so much hope and passion that he knew someday he was going to come back.
Yeah, and that's a great comment. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true when we think about, the father just will never give up hope that that boy will come back. In a very real sense, the son, in having wished his father dead, has made himself dead, right? He has distanced himself that far and has lost himself. Good Jew feeding pigs, that doesn't work, right? That he's given up himself. in good Orthodox Judaism, he has rendered himself dead because he's decided to break code and to violate, the core principles of being a Jew. So, but you're right. I think the Father would feel that way. That doggone it, I won't stop hoping until I'm given proof otherwise. So. Jeez, I don't think. Yeah, well, I knew, Charlie, you would.
A little bit last week, and I know you do not want to get into politics, but there's a socialistic tint to this, besides compassion. Is there not, or am I? I mean, bringing everyone up equal is in my mind socialistic. Now, we're all given different talents, and Lord knows I missed a lot, but some people have advantages and they do better.
Right.
And so is society not better off having that happen as opposed to having everybody equal? I guess is my question.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's I think it's a fundamental question actually when we take a look at why the world is the way it is, and I think it's a question that actually Jesus begs when he introduces the kingdom of heaven. We pray the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So Jesus isn't really interested in the socialism question. He's interested in the kingdom. And the kingdom is an invitation for us to make our world about their world. And here's the thing. I got into this. Well, here's the thing. We approach that, and this is back to what I was saying earlier, we approach that as like, what do I have to do? How much do I have to give away? How much do I have to tithe? What's the minimum? I heard a great stewardship sermon once that the minimum becomes for us the maximum, right? So, is 10% enough? You're missing the whole point. The whole point is, and you heard me say this before, an invitation to joy. The kingdom is an invitation to joy, right? And I used this analogy. I don't know if I used it back. Well, I used it. Well, yeah, I may have used it last week. Can't remember. I got so many groups I talked to. And I'll finish with this answer that question, but I think it speaks to the whole thing. We talked about best seats last week, right? And we talked about, how, we all kind of had this desire to sort of, hey, man, got the front row, going to see Fleetwood Mac, front row seats. And maybe you talked a little bit about your best seats when you're in your small groups, like what were the best seats you've ever had? So picture this. You get the best seats, man. First row, Stevie Nicks could be right in front of me. It's going to be great. And you're walking up to the arena, and you get to the door, and the guy who's taking tickets says, "Oh, you know what? Thank you for good to have these tickets because actually these tickets we want to give to another family who's never had the chance to be in the front row, and we want to switch those out for their tickets, which are on the top row of the top deck. And we know that you are going to experience joy in that." And you say, "Well, front row, Stevie Nicks. It's going to be." Say, but you are ultimately going to experience sitting in the top row of the arena, looking down and seeing that family would never, ever have a prayer of experiencing that. You're going to watch them, and you are going to experience joy. And it's that kind of a conversion that I think Jesus invites us into when he invites us into the kingdom. Because there's so much of us that is so resistant to that. It's like, what do you mean? You're asking me to, well, how much little can I get away with in order to experience this joy? And Jesus says, if you're talking that way, you've missed the whole point. The whole point is, I want you to jump in the deep end. Because that's where the joy is. So I think that's, so that's a socialism thing. He didn't care about that. It's like, I'm trying to get you to joy. I'm not trying to get you in an argument about socialism versus, capitalism versus communism. And he said, that, whatever. There's something more deep than that. So,
Thank you.
yep, thank you. All right, let me pray. Thanks, oh God, for your word. We pray that you will allow this to serve as grist for our mill, and that we may, through our wrestling with your teaching, discover more the joy you intend for us. I'm trying to get you to joy. I'm not trying to get you in an argument. Peace.
Trouble left.